Well, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome this evening Christopher Caldwell, who is speaking in the LSE European Institute's Future of Europe public lecture series, and this is in partnership with the Forum for European Philosophy. Now, Christopher Caldwell, as many of you will probably know, is a regular columnist for the Financial Times. He's a senior editor of the Weekly Standard, which is a lively and iconoclastic publication of the thoughtful political right. And he also writes inter alia for the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, many other publications. Now, in our world of commentary and blogging overload, it's always seemed to me that Christopher Caldwell is one thinker really worth finding the time for. And those who read his columns, particularly in the Saturday FT, will know how original and readable his takes are on current policy issues and current topical themes, and just how widely he casts his net. Someone who can always be read, as they say, for pleasure and profit. And pursuing that rather 18th century turn of phrase brings us to Christopher's latest book and its title, Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, which I hardly need to tell an LSE audience is, of course, a play on Edmund Burke's magisterial Reflections on the Revolution in France. Now, Christopher's book, which some of you may have seen sort of trailed or extracts from recently in either Prospect magazine or in the Sunday Times, does not address, obviously, an event which is so immediately transformational as the French Revolution. Rather, it considers the implications of a longer-term social process which we are seeing. But perhaps like Edmund Burke, it sounds a warning of what follows, or what could follow, if social and political change do not work with the grain of society. And in his book, which is subtitled, as you've probably seen, I'm not sure how much detail there is here, or maybe the events leaflet, but anyway, the subtitle of the book is Immigration, Islam, and the West. And in it, Christopher asks some searching questions about identity, about multiculturalism, about social cohesion, about solidarity. So we very much look forward to what he's going to say, and as per our usual format, we will leave a decent amount of time for questions from the floor. I'm happy to say to those of you who haven't seen it, that Christopher's book, which is just published in the last 2-3 days, is outside and on sale, and he's willing to sign anyone who wishes to purchase it immediately after this session, which I think will be around about 7:45, 7:50 or so. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Christopher Caldwell.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Well, thank you. You're very nice to come, and I'm very happy to be here. It's I hope everyone can hear me. Tonight I have a book out, as you've just heard. Tonight I'd like to. It's rather too wide-ranging a book to tell you about all in one night. So I'd like to talk about a small corner of it, which I would say would be the hidden costs of immigration. And before I start, I'd like to talk to you, though, about a little problem that I'm having in talking about this book in general. What first drew me to immigration when I started writing about it in the United States about 2 decades ago was its complexity. Immigration is about the economy and cultures and languages and literatures and how people form families and morals. And when immigrants come from a different culture, which they don't always, but often do, and still more from a different faith, immigration is about conflict, which makes it a very good journalistic story. And immigration is about conflict in the best of circumstances. Now, I believe, and I have believed for about the last 20 years, that Europe's immigration and integration issues are much more complex than the ones we face in the United States, because they involve many nations, and they're much more conflictual, largely because they involve Islam. And although my book has a very simple theme, which is that you cannot have the same Europe with different people, It has a lot of arguments and a lot of stories in it, and I hope that they do justice to the complexity of the European issue. The problem is that there's a limit to how much complexity one can get across to someone who hasn't read the book. I mean, I like to think of this book as a sort of patient Tocquevillian dissection of the state of immigration in Europe, and particularly Muslim immigration, at a moment when it's first becoming clear that Europe is turning into something else. But the problem is that people who are interested in immigration, or people who like to talk about it, tend to be Manichaean. So I suspect that a lot of readers and reviewers and interviewers and people who come to lectures like these, because this is the way it was with most of the people I interviewed too. Most people want to just get to the bottom line. They want to know, is this a love book or is this a doom book? You know, is this like is this let's love one another, or is this like the shadow of the sword over Europe? And if your book doesn't fit into one of those categories, and I don't believe mine does, people can be kind of brought up short. So before I get rolling, I'd like to give you a sort of a rough idea of what the book is about and where it goes. The book asks what kind of Europe is resulting from decades of mass immigration, and whether Europeans find it acceptable. This is not an idealistic book. It's not about the struggles of immigrants, and it's not about social justice, and it certainly doesn't try to lecture Europeans of any persuasion about what kind of society they should try to create under conditions of globalization. It's written from a critical distance, and I hope that that's the best thing that an American can bring to this subject. Another thing that I might be able to bring as an American is a perspective is a sort of pan-European perspective. Many Europeans blame their problems with integration on really parochial factors within their individual countries. So if only so-and-so hadn't been so lenient with asylum applications when he was Home Secretary, we wouldn't have this problem. Or if Jürgen Rutgers hadn't said those terrible things about Indians when he was the minister-president, well, then we'd have a much better relationship with our immigrants. Or if only our colonies had been there and not here, or if only we hadn't joined the Iraq War coalition, or if we had, and so on. The impression that is left is that the immigration problem in Europe is a diverse phenomenon. And I think that's false. I don't think Europe's immigration situation is particularly diverse, even if the immigrants and the receiving countries that make it up are quite diverse. If you leave aside the economic crisis that began in 2008, running a multicultural society is the main problem facing, or you could say the main challenge, if you prefer, facing every country in Western Europe. And if you understand how immigration, Islam, and native European culture interact in any Western European country, you can get, if not an exact prediction, you can have a rough and ready idea of how they'll react in how they'll interact in any other European country. No matter what its former national character, no matter whether it conquered an empire, no matter what its role in World War II, no matter what its role in Iraq, sorry, no matter what the provenance of its Muslim immigrants. Now, all these European countries have the same shrinking native populations. All countries make the same diagnoses of their immigrant challenges, and they put forward the same economic and social policies, which are generally involve favoring more skilled immigration over unskilled immigration. I mean, you'll always run across interesting quirks. I mean, some favorites of mine are that, in Sweden, which has a large number of Iraqi Kurds among its population, you have a situation where the Muslim immigrants of Sweden are almost certainly more pro-American than the larger society, which is not the case in all European countries. In Britain, I think in most of Europe, the most divisive issues between immigrants and natives involve gender relations. I would say that in Britain, they involve foreign policy. So I try to do justice to these particularities, but in their broad outlines, the immigration and integration problems in Western countries are largely the same. My book is a kind of a triptych. The first part gives a bit of history and describes the economic, political, and cultural situation that made mass immigration possible for the first time in European history. I believe it was a combination of remorse over World War II, combined with a desire to project a tolerant face to the world in the context of the Cold War, that made Europeans more reluctant than they would historically have been to express their misgivings over large-scale immigration. There are some people who say that Europe has always been a continent of immigrants, but this strikes me as counter-historical. There are issues of scale here, and it is sort of a mystery to me why so many Europeans feel the need, whatever they think about the present wave of immigration, why so many Europeans feel the need to deny that it's quite a new phenomenon for Europe. The first section of this book ends by asking whether the dominant European attitude towards immigration is one of tolerance, as Europeans have flattered themselves, or whether it's one of fear and or maybe conformism. Second part of the book describes, pardon me if I pour a glass of water, describes the way immigrant communities have formed and how they've interacted to other communities already in Europe. I discuss segregation, both the kind that results sometimes from government policy, as in Sweden, and the kind that results from the preferences of newcomers, such as the kind that's described in the amazing sociological work of the German sociologist Ralph Celan, which he calls ethnic colonies. The last part of this book, which is about how Europe is reacting, politically to this changed landscape, is where I discuss this idea, which is that, to repeat, you cannot have the same Europe with different people. This is naturally where religion comes up. And religion is a place where I think my book risks being badly misunderstood. Now, since religion, and particularly Islam, is important in my book, and since I'm not going to talk about it much tonight in what follows, I would just like to discuss briefly, so you know, how I deal with Islam here. The one thing I've tried to do, as I think I do in all my journalism, is to leave religious doctrines out of this book. I'm not a Muslim, I don't read Arabic, and the one thing that has made me very comfortable and strikes me as very ridiculous is when politicians or commentators try to lecture not just Muslims, but people of any faith on what their faith tells them to believe. That is nowhere in my book. But religion as a social phenomenon strikes me as massively important. I think most European writers and commentators tend to think of religion as a strong opinion, irrationally held, and I disagree with this. I think religion has a major role in shaping public values, and that it ought to. So the fact that, for instance, in Amsterdam, believing Muslims outnumber believing Catholics and outnumber all believing Protestant faiths combined, that strikes me as really consequential. It means that a lot of the bedrock thinking about the good life, about the ultimate goals of society, about the metaphysics and meaning of life, a lot of the best and most serious thinking on that is being done by Muslims. Clashes over whether you ought to be able to wear a veil in school or whether you can publish cartoons of Mohammed, they matter a great deal. They're just the They're just what you can see on the surface of a lot of very serious thinking about how we ought to lead our lives and how society ought to be ordered. Something that I maybe don't say precisely, and I might put a little bit harshly now, is that the dominant European belief system, whether you call it multiculturalism, the tolerant society, or secularism, it may not be a worldview so much as a placeholder where a worldview ought to be. The American Secretary of State Dean Acheson once said about Britain that it has lost an empire but has not found a role. I'm sure you've heard that 800 gazillion times, and I too actually think that's one of those overrated lame quotes that doesn't say as much as people think it does. But I like to use it as a template for something I think is going on in Europe now, which is that I think that Europe has lost a belief system and has not really found a substitute. So, in that situation where there is no real belief system in Europe, to worry that Islam will play an overlarge role in shaping the belief system of the Europe to come does not strike me as being anti-Muslim. I think it's no insult to Muslims to say that they are taking the serious things of life more seriously than most Christians and most of their secular fellow citizens. I think Tariq Ramadan believes this. I think the late Pim Fortuyn believed this. And despite the fact that they might be considered ideological opposites, I think that their analyses of the role of religion in European life are pretty much identical. Although Ramadan believes religion is a good thing and Fortuyn believed it's a bad thing. Or you could say that Ramadan believes it's a real thing and Fortuyn believes it's a false thing. But I believe their visions are similar. In a way, you can say that the issue with Islam is not that it offers Europe little, but that it offers it a great deal. And since we're in London, I thought I would mention a passage in the book that I took from a speech from Thomas Carlyle. It's one of the speeches that were compiled into his book on heroes and hero worship. In May of 1840, Carlyle gave a lecture on Muhammad. And in the middle of this lecture, it was a lecture on Muhammad which was also an attack on utilitarianism. And I'm sorry to attack utilitarianism at LSE, but in the middle of the lecture, John Stuart Mill leapt up from his seat and screamed at him. And Carlyle's argument was that unlike modern utilitarian Europeans, Muhammad had grasped the deadly earnest of all that we do on earth, and that he thus taught a lesson that men forget at their peril. This earnest, Carlyle said, and here I'll read, is the first of all truths. It is venerable under all embodiments. What is the chief end of man here below? Muhammad has answered this question in a way that might put some of us to shame. He does not, like a Bentham, a Paley, take right and wrong and calculate profit and loss, ultimate pleasure of the one and of the other, and summing it all up by addition and subtraction into a net result, ask you whether on the whole the right does not preponderate considerably. Benthamite utility, virtue by profit and loss, reducing this God's world to a dead, brute steam engine, the infinite celestial soul of man to a kind of hay balance for weighting hay and thistles on, pleasures and pains on. If you ask me which gives, Muhammad or they, the beggarlier and falser view of man and his destinies in the universe, I will answer, it is not Muhammad. Anyway, that strikes me as a mid-19th century version of some of the problems we're going through now. Now, a guy who interviewed me on the radio yesterday described the book by saying, here comes Chris Caldwell with the case against immigration. I can see some things that might lead him to say so, but I absolutely reject that description. again, as I say, one of the last things I want to do as an American coming to Europe is to tell people how to run their own sovereign nations. My book does not make a case against immigration. But it is fair to say that it dwells on hidden costs of immigration, and I'll devote the rest of my time to that. Because some of these, some of the most provocative maybe and easily misunderstood statements in the book concern those hidden costs. Now, there's an obvious economic way to look at the hidden costs of immigration. The Oxford demographer David Coleman has urged that when we tally up the economic impact of immigration, that we should also consider, quote, the total costs of the integration process and of the associated immigration and race relations businesses, the costs of meeting special education, health, and housing needs of immigrants, the net effects upon the education of ordinary children in immigrant areas, the permanent need to regenerate urban areas of immigrant settlement instead of demolishing them, issues of crime and public order, and the multiplier effect on future immigration. Now, there are things that people might object to in that, like the passage on the education of ordinary children, but there's something in here that I think is really intelligent, and that is, in fact, I think Coleman's work is generally quite intelligent, and that is the multiplier effect on future immigration, because that brings up a hidden cost that Europeans have never really come to terms with. And that is a commitment to mass immigration means a commitment to permanent mass immigration. And this is the fact that people have not understood this is part of the explanation for why immigration has continued steadily far above the levels at which public opinion would seem to wish. And it explains why the market always wants more, the economy wants more immigrants than politics will deliver. And this is what I mean by the revolution in Europe. I want to show you this push towards constant expansion or constant maintenance of immigration in two ways. First, economically. Economically, accounts of the benefits of immigration often describe the jobs that first-generation immigrants take as the jobs that no European wants. Now, of course, what is really meant is the jobs that no European wants to do at a particular wage, and that has consequences. Recently, an immigration specialist named Philip Martin of the University of California, Davis, drew parallels between today's migrations and the movement of would-be settlers to North America in the 18th century. Now, back then, migrants paid the cost of their own resettlement through an indenture. That is, they promised a certain number of years of labor to the landowner who fronted their voyage. You could say that perhaps today's immigrants pay an updated kind of indenture in the form of rights, living as they often do in an ambiguous legal status that condemns them only to the lowest jobs. If there really are jobs that Europeans won't do at any price, then this indenture is a big part of what natives believe they are getting out of immigration. Now, whether or not this indenture is fair depends on the context in which you view it. On the one hand, the arrangement is corrosive of rights, of the idea of rights, because it creates two tiers of rights in the destination country. Trade unions have always said this. On the other hand, the supposed victims, the immigrants, are unlikely to complain because they are doing better than they would have done in their native countries. But there's a hitch, and that is that the benefits of this indenture, if we can call it that, accrue to immigrants' new countries only as long as immigrants are illegal or marginal or transitional. And immigrants don't, and we think they shouldn't, stay that way forever. As soon as they are legally and socially assimilated in the way that society professes and perhaps pretends to want, then they acquire all sorts of rights and expectations. They become Europeans, who by definition will no longer do the jobs that no European wants. So the moment immigration is successful socially, the main reason society used to justify it economically disappears along with the economic need. So at that point, to ensure that the jobs nobody wants gets done, society has to get more immigrants. If you were really you were a left-leaning economist, you would say that it needs to recruit a new reserve army of foreign-born grunt workers. The only alternative to that would be to maintain the precariousness of immigrants' legal status into the next generation by maintaining birthright citizenship, which does not sound much better. It sounds like a modern-day type of feudalism. But either way, the gains from immigration all must be redeemed again in the next generation. That is, they seem to be borrowed and not permanently earned. There's a contradiction. The faster and more thoroughly immigrants adapt to your society, the more immigrants you need. So a momentum develops. Now, there's another way to look at this sort of momentum towards permanent immigration. I think that that was the economic logic, but I think that the economic logic for mass immigration, whether it's grown stronger or weaker over the years, has certainly grown much less prominent in the defenses of immigration made by politicians. Today, I think immigration and integration and multiculturalism are more commonly defended in terms of diversity. But at the heart of the ideology of diversity, which is supposed to enrich and strengthen nations, there is also a kind of illogic, which is if a diverse population enriches and strengthens nations as much as people claim, why would any nation want its immigrants to assimilate? That would be drawing down the nation's valuable fund of diversity. And so in this respect, you know, Ethiopians are for running Ethiopian restaurants. They're not for moving into sort of mid-level corporate hierarchies. If you're going to assimilate immigrants into the heart of society, then in order to keep the supply of diversity on tap, you again need more immigration. So you have a situation where European leaders are defending large-scale immigration in one breath by saying it's going to make their countries different through diversity, and in the next breath saying that it will leave them the same through integration. And you can't really you can't do both at the same time. Now, diversity, I would say, in its early days, won its most heartfelt assent at the level of consumerism, mostly, you know, cuisine and fashion. I talk about this a lot in the book, but it's maybe European populations were thrilled by the novelties that immigration brought, you know, from samba to hashish to baba ganoush. But from the 1960s on, immigration began to change things, not just in the marketplace, but in the core relationships and constitutional structures of society. And although I don't have much time, I would like to address that too, because it is one of the it's one of the perhaps most provocative things I say in the book, that one of the prices, one of the hidden costs of immigration, is that it exacts a steep price in constitutional rights and freedoms for the people in the receiving country. There's a very obvious instance, and it will be obvious here in London, and I bring it up because I'm in London. I don't deal with it too much in my book, and that is surveillance. I don't deal with surveillance. I deal with it a bit, but not too much in my book because I don't deal with terrorism or counterterrorism outside of one chapter. But in most Western countries now, the surveillance of radical imams and mosques has been stepped up. It's easy, such practices are open to criticism as being racist or prejudiced, or as putting young people under surveillance just because they are Muslim. Since they are easily criticized as racist, a regime of enhanced eavesdropping on everyone may be, for politicians, the path of least constitutional resistance. In countries where immigrant customs are considered to repress women, you have another kind of invasion of rights. I mentioned in the book the example of Sweden. In Sweden, you have a large number of East African immigrants, which is a place that a place where the practice of female circumcision is common. One point I make in the book is that the only European value that Europeans put forward, I believe, to immigrants as a real non-negotiable demand, a real deal breaker for whether you can stay in the country or not, is European ideas of sexual freedom. And the ideas about sexual freedom and assimilation are so tightly bound together that Sweden has a cabinet member, at the time of my writing, and now it's Nyamko Sabuni, who's born in Burundi, has a cabinet member who serves as the so-called Minister of Integration and Gender Equality, as if those were just two different words for the same thing. I mention in passing in the course of the book, and I think it's very interesting, that Ms. Sabuni suggested at one point having national genital examinations for young girls in Sweden, nationwide examinations of these girls at a certain age, to discover whether they had been abused in that way. That strikes me as a sort of an unthinkable intrusion on the lives of Swedes, or one that would have been before the age of immigration. The most maybe thoroughgoing change in the constitutional structure that results when you have a world of diversity, or when you need to manage diversity when you're running a multicultural society, I would say is affirmative action. And I would argue that the centerpiece of Nicolas Sarkozy's domestic policy has rested on what he calls, quote, the remarkable experiment undertaken at Sciences Po. And by this he means affirmative action. In 2001, the Institute of Political Studies, Sciences Po as it's called, launched a program that would allow students from what they call priority education zones to bypass its written examination and submit to an oral interview instead. These zones were not randomly chosen. They were all poor areas with heavy immigrant populations. And the director of Sciences Po said, well, look, we're not recruiting these people because they're poor, Arab, or black, but because they are good. And I think this is one of those little white lies that are the mainstay of all affirmative action programs, because racial diversity was clearly the overarching goal. And the program's defenders have at numerous times described this as a means of, quote, integrating, unquote, Sciences Po. Now there have been a lot of lawsuits. This has run through the courts in France. But whether you like affirmative action or not, it does great damage to the French idea of citoyenneté, which is based on equality of status that is quite absolute, to the point where there are certain voluntary associations that France doesn't even recognize as sort of favoring people over others. The introduction of affirmative action is a major shift in European life. The introduction of affirmative action, whether you means a revocation of the right of freedom of association. That is, if you have a business and the 20 employees of your business are all white, that used to be, well, it's just one of those things that happens. In the United States, that's no longer true. It becomes the government's business if all 20 employees of your business are white. Now, why was this not considered a great loss of a constitutional right in the United States? The reason it wasn't is that the United States enacted affirmative action in response to our race problem, a problem of racial segregation that had lasted for about 400 years, and over which the most violent war in the history of the world up to that date had been fought, and which continued until after World War II with all its lessons. In other words, in the United States, this was perceived as an extreme measure, but in constitutional terms, but passed in response to an extreme emergency in constitutional and human rights terms. In Europe, when you have affirmative action, it is tough to see what the parallel emergency is that would justify the revocation of those rights. In France, to stick with the Sarkozy case, there's a lot of talk of colonialism. But colonialism is a problem that has receded much further into the past than institutionalized racism had in the United States in the 1960s. And I don't see the emergency that is going to create the political will for, I should add that in the United States, there is no widespread support for affirmative action. Whenever it is brought to a referendum, it is rejected. It has been kept in place largely in states like California through the actions of courts. So given that it has such a weak hold on American life in response to such a dire emergency, I don't see what the emergency is in Europe that is going to make it tolerable to populations over the long term. I think that's about enough examples, and I would like to conclude now by saying that, by telling you what I'm talking about when I talk about a revolution in Europe or not being able to have the same Europe with different people. I believe that Europeans are becoming a society much more on the American model. Europe's difficulty is that I think that you have a much more complicated society to manage than Americans have. When I say you're becoming a society on the American model, what I mean is that Europe is becoming a nation of immigrants. And this sounds like, nation of immigrants sounds like an empty cliche. You know, America is a nation of immigrants. Europeans often say it just to mean that, wow, you know, you can never tell what kind of surname an American will have. And Americans say it as a kind of boast to mean that, wow, we're somehow either more tolerant or more accepting of difference or more capable of turning foreigners into natives. But I don't think that's what it means at all. I think being a nation of immigrants is being willing to be changed by foreigners. When you say that America is a nation of immigrants, you say that it is a nation that has consented to a permanent demographic revolution. And this is the revolution in Europe that I'm talking about. The problem that the book identifies is that Europeans have wound up in this revolution without really explicitly consenting to it the way Americans have. I mean, Europeans are not ignorant of the virtues of the United States' melting pot, but they've always considered American-style immigration a kind of Faustian bargain. And all of the things that Europeans have traditionally admired at a distance about the United States, the dynamism, the energy, the unpredictability, the lack of hang-ups, Europe is going to get those. But I think it's also going to get all of the things that Europe has traditionally disliked about the United States. The impermanence, the people who are totally indifferent to what their grandparents did and equally indifferent to whether their grandchildren's way of life will be determined by themselves or by someone else. And Americans' tendency, in the absence of such traditions, to turn to things like religion. Europe is going to get that too. And that's what I mean when I say that you cannot have the same Europe with different people. Thank you very much.
Well, Christopher, thank you for some very thoughtful and stimulating ideas and commentary. I hope in the best tradition, as LSE tradition will, as I suggested earlier, I'll be able to have a lively discussion now. There were so many thoughts you floated that certainly I'd wish to come back on, but I will exercise an even lighter touch than usual as moderator for now and open things to the floor. If, please, you could say who you are, put your hand up, say who you are, what institution, or just what your calling is or interest in life, and wait for the microphone to be brought to you. That would be great. And as like all moderators, I will say, please, no speeches, keep it short and punchy, and don't smuggle in a second question, unless it's at least without my consent. Okay, there are somebody. Would you like to take them individually, or in clusters of three, or? Would you like to?
Whatever the custom of the country is.
If I'm fashionable, take them clusters of three. I'm not always persuaded of the merits. It enables the speaker sometimes
to get off the hook, doesn't it? Yeah.
Sidestep other questions.
Yeah. Okay, clusters of three then.
Yeah.
Hello. I thoroughly enjoyed your lecture. Thank you very much. My name is Alexander Durst. I'm a student of international relations here at the LSE.
Thank you.
You mentioned the fact that you didn't see what the emergency was, for Europeans. You basically questioned the fact that there was an urgency in Europe.
Yeah.
And that would induce Europeans to accept the kind of affirmative action that happened in America. But what do you make of the terrifying riots that happened in France, a couple of months ago, or the kind of scandals, the fact, for instance, that quite a few terrorists, in the 9/11 attacks were actually of British origin, etc. Doesn't that indicate that there is the kind of crisis that would induce Europeans to change their attitudes and policies?
Well, I think that's an emergency of public order. It's violence. All countries have violence. All countries have protests by have-nots. All countries have have-nots. I don't know that requires the constitutional change of the constitutional understanding of freedom of association, or the replacement of individual rights by group rights. Since I think you might be a German speaker, you're not. No, I'm sorry. There's a great book by a German jurist, as they call him, a member of the Supreme Court, called Udo de Fabio, which is called The Culture of Freedom. It's got a fascinating treatment of the replacement of individual rights by group rights. But just to finish my thought, I distinguish between an emergency of public order and a constitutional emergency. The American race problem was a situation that sort of was standing violence to the American Constitution and had been doing so for hundreds of years. And there had never been a year in the history of the American Republic when it was not perceived as a catastrophic shame, a sort of a repudiation of the entire American project. And I think that after the Second World War, with the lessons it brought, and then with the development of the mass media, which conveyed more exactly to Northern and Western Americans what was going on in the South. It was a situation that could not be tolerated. It was an emergency in that sense. It was so I don't know. I do not think that riots and terrorism constitute the same kind of emergency. No.
Thank you. Over to this side of the room. Who would like to ask a question? The lady in pink jumper, yes.
Tendai Bloom from Queen Mary. I was just wondering what you're advocating then.
Nothing. I must say, this is a book of analysis rather than of preaching. It is not a polemic. I think that there's if you read the book, you'll get a pretty clear idea of where I'm coming from and sort of what my, let's say, opinions and my political leanings are. But as far as explicitly saying Europe should do this or do that, I really have no opinion on it. It's not my country, and I could tell you some best practices from the United States, but I'm not sure that those would really apply to Europe.
Thank you. Okay, go back here. Gentleman there in blue.
Hello, my name is Alex Ratzener. I'm an Austrian citizen who spent the last 10 years in Amsterdam. And I do have a question with regard to your analysis, which is, you mentioned that the issue that Europeans have to cope with is an issue of diversity. My experience of what people in Holland found difficult, people like Pimford Town as well, was that in the second generation of the immigrants, mainly from Morocco, one was moving from a different experience that people had of immigration leading to diversity, then leading to integration, to a kind of more unified ideology that was different from the ideology of integration and diversity within the country. So the question that I have is, you were talking a lot about immigration. The challenge is one of diversity. The way that I felt it, that people felt it in the Netherlands, was that it was the challenge of more of a new uniformity suddenly coming in and questioning the values of that had been there for women, for other things, and it wasn't the diversity that was considered the problem.
The new uniformity coming from? Yeah, the new uniformity coming from where?
From a kind of the concern, the fear of a kind of Islamist type of ideology coming in and demanding changes in the Dutch society. All swimming pools should have divided hours for men and women. All schools should not have duties for girls to learn how to swim, when everybody in Holland had to learn how to swim, etc. Examples like that.
Well, this is yes. This is an example of what I'm talking about when I say that being a country of immigrants means consenting to see your country changed, and there are questions of how that. There are questions of how that could be done, and I think these are questions of scale. They're questions of big and little, and they come up whenever people like Rowan, like Rowan Williamson, Rowan Williams discusses Sharia, imposition of Sharia, and things like that. There are certain things that you know, if you forced every city in France to have segregated swimming hours for men and women, that would obviously be an outrage, and it would obviously be a capitulation of the majority society to the loud voice of these people who want a sort of theocratic Muslim law. However, if you're in a local town which has a local city authority and you have a decentralized government, it might just be answer, you know, if you had a town of 5,000 people that's 80% Muslim and people vote for it, well, that might be perfectly fine under circumstances of subsidiarity. It has to do with the sort of constitutional order you have. I mean, in France was maybe a bad example to pick, because I've just finished talking about citoyenneté and the tradition that all French people are supposed to be alike in every particular. So local laws don't work well there. In the United States, demands of this sort are generally decided by what the people at the local level want, you know? So, I mean, not to dwell too long on your question, I think it's interesting that it was the Dutch minister, Piet Hein Donner, I mean, you might remember from about 5 years ago, who said, you know, if a majority of Dutch people voted for Sharia, we would have it. And he said, that's democracy. And he's right. It's not liberalism, but it's democracy. So, yeah.
Chris, if I may, just you mentioned France again there, and you cited an example, an ostensible example anyway, of affirmative action when you mentioned Sciences Po. It's very interesting, if you look at, in fact, the difficulties which the French government has actually tried, this government has tried to be quite pioneering and saying, well, the beginning of wisdom, well, our starting point is that there are particular socio-economic problems which seem to be afflicting certain parts of the country in which immigrants are concentrated. But if we're to start to devise public policy solutions to make some impression on this problem, the beginning of wisdom would be to waive for the time being our official colour-blind policy and actually start gathering information, census information on the ethnicity of particular groups of the population. And it looked as though that was actually going to go through, but a lot of the left in particular threw up its hands in horror and say that this is all fascistic and we've been there, done that, we don't want to ever go down that road again, and so on. It sounds as though the government's going to stick to its grounds, and when I was in France, in fact, just yesterday again, it seems that the government may well be going to backtrack on that. So much for not even getting to, let alone full-scale affirmative action, it's not even getting to base one. And you mentioned the particular Sciences Po project. I'm the LSE program director of the double master's degree with Sciences Po. I was very keen to meet, as this was about a year ago, I was asked would I meet with a group of students from Sciences Po who've come in on this the special flight path you've mentioned for kids from the banlieue to actually be given this fantastic opportunity. And I said, yes, of course, and I was looking forward to meeting them. And I was fully expecting to meet at least that some of them would be from ethnic minorities. Well, they were indeed from all poor parts of the banlieue, but they were all white French. Which was quite an eye-opener, and which suggests to me again that there is at the very least a nervousness or reticence about picking out a group of let's say Arab origin French citizens to give them that helping hand up. And if you like the line of least resistance was followed, they were all white working class French. We've been beguiled by this idea that that France, the most Jacobin of countries and colourblind of countries, is going down this route. Even France isn't. And I mean, cases of affirmative action still seem to be, broadly speaking, in Europe, very few and far between. But having said that, clearly we are revising or reviewing, different countries are reviewing their models of multiculturalism and integration. The British and the Dutch going one way, saying maybe we've gone too far down the multicultural road, and we need to think more a bit about building solidarity and some sense of cohesion.
Right.
And then the French
are moving.
very flirting at the margins with maybe lightening up their very secularist Jacobin model,
So you think there's
colourblind.
a convergence of...
Well, I mean, I think there is some sort of sense that there's probably a via media which actually does foster a sense of allegiance towards the host or the member nation state, whilst actually not just tolerating but actually cultivating and regarding diversity as a valuable thing. And I just think the sense is across so many European countries that we have not got that balance right. But we're all coming to it in different ways. But I don't see affirmative action playing any role in that as far as I can see. Gentlemen. Sorry, yes, in the sort of khaki green shirt. I'm so sorry, it's coming.
Thank you. Hi, from the title it sounded, sorry, my name is Craig Willey, I'm studying international history at LSE. From the title I assumed that this was going to be a doom book, as you were saying in the introduction, because Burke was, let's see the latest, very negative about the French Revolution and its consequences.
Right.
So I wasn't sure if this was going to be sort of a Mark Stein or Melanie Phillips, Londonistan kind of book, but I don't agree with everything you've said, but I appreciate the need to have discussion. And I think the thing I agree with most in what you said was the idea that Europe is being Americanized by this. Because, and I think the French example is the best, because in America they have almost, well, ever since they have had censuses, they've been tracking racial groups and ethnic backgrounds. And you're seeing this in Europe, and you are seeing, you're seeing communities. This neighborhood is this kind of neighborhood, ethnic neighborhood, this neighborhood is Jewish, this neighborhood is Irish, and in Europe you're seeing similar patterns. And you're seeing problems of race relations, I think in many cases comparable to what you see with African Americans in Europe.
Yeah.
But the part I disagree with is maybe the overemphasis on religion, because I don't think that is really the core of the issue. I think that there is an assumption that because second generation Muslims will self-identify more as Muslims than maybe their parents do, that this is a sign that they're becoming more religious. And despite my accent, I've been living a long time in both France and the UK. And I think young people of ethnic minority background, whether Muslim, black in France or the UK, most they're very normal, very normal. That is my assessment. I think that who are their idols? It's the R&B and rap. This is not Sharia law. This is probably the opposite. And so and I'm not saying none of them are religious, but I'm saying I think that tends to get overstated. And I think the example of the UK is helpful because you see similar race relations problems, whether it's Muslim minority or the Hindu minority or the black minority, and that black minority is Caribbean and African, and they've got divergent issues. So my question would be, after I've spoken a little while, do you think religion is as important, or do you think it is just a kind of Americanization because Europe is learning about race relations, which is something which is relatively new in its history, notwithstanding some small black and other communities around Europe, historical black and other communities, rather than really an issue about religion, because this gives it these overtones. Anyway.
Right. I know. That's a fantastic question. It goes in about 5 different directions. Tell me if there's a corner of it that I miss. I want to stress that the remarks I made about religion, I made only. They were sort of prefatory to the remarks I was going to make about the hidden costs of immigration, just because I think that when you mention the remarks I made about religion had more to do with the doom aspects that you brought up than they did with the hidden costs aspect. But I think actually that religion is part of the Americanization. Why is the United States, which is just as advanced as these European countries and roughly on a par in terms of per capita income, and has the same configuration of mass media and the same kind of same kind of political system? Why is it so much more religious? I would say that it has something to do with the sort of commitment to change and flux and the famous English allergy to religious zeal has something to do with the village manse always being in the same place that it was for the last 1,000 years. But when you're in the United States and a large part of the population is living in towns that were built in, that were desert in 2003, I don't think it's a coincidence that the most religious parts of the country are the most transient parts of the country. So I do actually think that over the medium term, openness to the world will create more religiosity, will tend to create more religiosity in Europe among all faiths. Maybe it won't become as religious as the United States. But if I at the risk of going a little bit off of my subject, I was reading an interesting older paper by the Harvard economist Danny Roderick, who writes a lot about globalization. And he came to the conclusion that, it's a study a few years old, but he came to the conclusion that larger governments are associated with more open economies. And it strikes me that people, will create structures of order the more open to the disorder of the world or the randomness of the world or the haphazardness of the world they are. And that I do think religion is one of those. But is there a heart of your question that I was missing?
Well, I suppose it would be to contrast the role of religion specifically, and specifically Islam. There might be a Christian or But it would be, how would you contrast the experience of Muslims in the UK, or perhaps compare to, say, Caribbean immigrants to France, or say Hindu or Christian immigrants to the UK? Does the fact that it's not Islamic make a big difference? Because in my opinion, it doesn't make a vast difference.
Well, there are on this kind of question. In my book, I've had to rely mostly on academic sociologists and people who do studies like that. And I think that the Muslim cultures do show certain divergences. On questions of, where is your allegiance, to your religion or to your country? They rate high on religion. On questions of demography, okay, you find that descendants of Pakistanis and of Bangladeshis sort of converge on the national birth rate more slowly than, say, the descendants of African Indians. Now, obviously, it's an open question whether this is due to religion or whether it's due to sort of some regional, cultural, or economic factor. I don't know, but I didn't go that deep into it. Okay.
Thank you. Try and find time for another two or three questions. Gentleman in the striped shirt.
Yes, hello. My name's Argyros, and I'm of Greek descent, and I've been in this country for quite considerable time. That's quite apparent. So the question I'm going to ask you is this, that you touched fairly briefly on the question of gender, and that to me is the critical factor, because you seem to support Islam very strongly. Now then, let's go back to what you referred to in Holland, Pim Fortuyn. Now, Pim Fortuyn, as you well know, was killed by a fanatical Muslim thug, if you like. Okay?
Well, he was killed by an animal rights activist
Was-
who did allude to Fortown's attitudes towards Muslims, but he was actually killed by an animal rights activist.
Beg your pardon.
His name was Volkert van der Gaa, I think was his name.
Okay.
Yeah,
So-
but go on, that's all right. Yeah.
But the thing that strikes me is the gender factor, which is, to me, the most important, which is that women in the Islamic countries that I have been to, and I've been to many of them, don't have anywhere near the rights and the equalities that women have in Europe. And so I would like to hear your opinion on that fact, because to me it is the critical one. Here, for example, when I was living in the Docklands area of London, I used to see women dressed in the full chador with young girls around about the age of 6, 7 perhaps, dressed exactly the same. And quite frankly, I don't want to see that here in Europe.
Yeah, all right. Well, in a way, I'm totally delighted to hear your opinion, because I have made the assertion in the book that I think is a rather controversial one, that it is feminism that is maybe the most divisive point between Europeans and Muslim immigrants. I'm surprised to hear you say you think that I'm a big partisan of the hardline Islamic view on this. No, okay, all right. I think it all depends. I have to say that I think these questions all depend on what kind of constitution you have. And I hope that I didn't sound too dismissive of the question that the young woman over by the pillar in the pink asked me earlier when she said, "What do you support?" But I'm not trying to be cute or coy. But I can see, I can see France banning the veil in schools, because France has a long tradition of uniformization of the national culture. In the American tradition, and I would say also in the British tradition, the idea of saying that a woman can't wear a scarf to school, you better have a really good reason for it, there's a presumption in laws against the veil that the women are sort of being coerced into doing it. And that, in fact, this was the idea of the Stasi Commission in France. The Stasi Commission was the commission that came up with the idea of banning the veil. Their basic assumption was that these girls who are going to school, except for a few mischief makers, okay, they don't really want to be wearing the veil. They're being forced to by their parents. So we're actually liberating them. Now, in America, this is a very contentious issue. In America, it's considered not a liberation, but the opposite, to try and remove the role of the parents. I think this really depends on what kind of constitution you live under. Now, as far as the full body covering, I mean, I must confess, I don't, it makes me uneasy to see it too. And I've been to places like Sweden, like in Malmö, in a housing project called Rosengård. And the women there they're mostly Anatolian, I think, with some Iraqis. That is, they're not Saudis, they don't come from cultures where it's traditional to wear that sort of thing. So in their case, it seems like some sort of statement of separation that they're making as, they want to mark themselves off as separate. I don't know, I don't know quite how to arrange this within a system of constitutional rights, except that I think that each country ought to arrange it according to the logic of its own constitution. Does that? You look unsatisfied with that.
I mean, yeah, okay. The heroine of the Netherlands, in my opinion, was Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Uh-huh.
And she was fantastic because she rejected Islam and stood up and said to the women of the Muslim religion in Holland, wake up, stop being subjected to religion, stop being subjected to men, stop being subjected to the fact that you're only worth half the value of a man in the Islamic religion.
Well, I'll tell you, Ayaan Hirsi Ali is one of the women I most admire in the world, and I've met her, I've written about her, and I think she's a brave, courageous woman. And however, she is also a hardline feminist and an outspoken atheist. And the ideal life that she describes is not going to be the ideal life for all women. And I think that in an American context, the women who want to live a more traditional life also have a right to that too. Do you know what I'm saying?
But she went to America.
Yeah, I know she went to America. That's you bet.
They wanted her to stand up and say the things that she was saying in Holland.
No, she's welcome to stand up and say the things she's saying in Holland. You know, but she's free to say the things she's saying in Holland. Yes.
Okay, I'd like to get in two more questions if possible. Over there, please. Yes, thank you.
I have a very little. My name is Sarab. I'm doing my master here at the European Institute. I have a very little question. If I understood it right, that you said that assimilation and like integration leads to more immigration. So because what we learn here is that it's a good thing in the European Union if you integrate the immigrants.
Yeah.
So do you see that then as a good thing that the European Union integrates them and they assimilate, or is that then
well, yeah, that's a great question, and this is this is something dealt with in a part of my book that I don't touch on. Any society has got to have a sort of coherence and loyalty, and I would say the undivided loyalty of its members. Yes, they must. I think that people must integrate. But could I ask, are you Turkish? Yeah. Because I think the Turkish immigration in Europe is really, I think, one of the most interesting. And in Germany, I think that among immigrations from Muslim countries, the Turkish immigration has probably been the most successful in terms of. If you leave aside, Arab oil sheikhs living in London who had lots of money when they came, etc. But the Turkish immigration has probably been the most successful in terms of economic results and in terms of having fewer social problems. Although, obviously there are issues with people from Eastern Anatolia and blah, blah, blah. However, I would say it's been the least successful in terms of integration, So the Turkish have followed what we in the United States would call the Chinese model. And one of the most interesting things in American scholarship on immigration is there's a Chinese American immigrant sociologist named Zhao Min who argues that the Chinese are more successful because they're not integrating, because they're closer to their families and they're further away from video games and the mall and fashions and other things, and then they go off to college and they become normal Americans there, having failed to develop the bad habits before. So I know that's going beyond what your question asked. Yes, I think integration is essential, at least from my point of view. But there are some interesting paradoxes about it.
Okay, we're going to have one more question. Ideally, when someone doesn't ask a question before, the lady in the white jacket, yes.
Yes, my name is Tara Healy Singh. Do you think it would be appropriate for immigrants who come to Europe to have to go through a screening process before being awarded citizenship and citizenship rights to make sure that their value system is compatible with the host community?
It depends on what you mean by value system. I will go back to my same weaselly answer as before, which is to say I don't want to give lessons to Europeans. However, I'll tell you what I think as an American. I tend to be, as far as my own country is concerned, I think that you need to have a pretty unambiguous loyalty towards your country, and that there can be I can see the case for, say, dual citizenship in the case of marriages between citizens of two countries. But eventually there has to come a point to choose. So as far as the value of love of country, yeah, I think that has to be unambiguous before you get in. If you're talking about more social values, the interesting case of the Naar Nederland video that the Dutch came up with a couple of years ago, just to make sure that immigrants were compatible. This goes to one of the things you're talking about. The Dutch, I'm not sure, I believe this was actually in the works at the time when Theo van Gogh was killed in 2004. But they had they made a video to show to immigrants. And the video basically said, come to the Netherlands. We have euthanasia here. Here's a picture of two men kissing. Here are some naked women on the beach, okay? You like it? You want to come? You know? And so that I find, now that I find a little bit, I find that a little bit bullying. Although I can see in the abstract that you would want people to share your values, but I think that takes it a bit far. Okay. Why? Because I think there's nothing illegitimate for it. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Why is it that these people are okay, but these people are kind of not okay?
I'll tell you. Yeah. Yes, I understand if you explain to people that it's a kind of a pluralistic society, but I don't. I sense an anti-religious agenda behind it. I sense that it says that there's something illegitimate about objecting to a woman baring her breasts or something.
I don't think that the issue in the Netherlands is an anti-Islamic problem, it's an anti-political ideology problem. That it's the political ideology, and because you have freedom of religion in the country, you leave religions in peace, and atheists can live, and other religions can live. But the religions don't bring their ideology into daily political life.
Yeah,
You mustn't be homosexual, you mustn't be, women are not consent. That's not part of their political agenda. That's part of their religious agenda.
Okay,
And I think that the issue that has led to a lot of the tensions was the politicization, not the religion. I don't think it is a religious problem.
Okay, I think that you and I might agree on. I think that you and I probably agree on the question of individual rights and the plurality of lifestyles. That it's okay, that if people swim naked on certain beaches, as long as they're private beaches, I would say, as an American. You might take a more liberal view as a Dutchman, huh? But I think what we're disagreeing over is the film. I object to sort of rubbing people's noses in it. Yeah, all right, okay. All right. Yeah, okay. Maybe I'm just being an American prude, basically, yeah? Okay.
Great. Well, sadly, we have to draw things to a close. Christopher, we've had a tremendous hour and 20 minutes, really stimulating and lively questions. And thank you to the questioners as well. I hope you will come back soon. I hope that that some of you will avail of yourselves of the opportunity to go and at least peruse and perhaps purchase Christopher's book, which is on sale outside and which he'd be very happy to sign. So thank you very much, and above all, thank you, Christopher.